president. But I was very disappointed in the extent to which he didn't answer some questions I think many of us had been hoping to hear him answer. You know, he didn't explain why, you know, there he was at the National Archives where the documents my dad is asked to have declassified actually reside, and he didn't explain why he won't declassify those documents. He didn't explain what's going to happen to the terrorists at Guantanamo when those third countries that he says will take some will tell the Obama administration what they've been saying for many years now, which is no thanks. We don't want hardened terrorists on our soil. He didn't explain how it is that he feels so confidently that America's court system actually is sufficient and is set up to be able to handle these terrorist cases. And I think that, you know, there are a lot of people, including, you know, Andy McCarthy, who prosecuted the blind sheikh, who's written at length in a terrific book I would actually commend to the Obama administration called Willful Blindness, about the very real problems with trying to deal with terrorism as a law enforcement matter. So I think, you know, the president's speech was unsatisfying, to say the least.
Now, in your father's speech, he made the case that there was no room for moderation. What I was struck is, and this is that President Obama's speech sort of framed a debate as saying, you know, some people want me to do this on the left, some people want me to do this on the right, and he was looking for middle ground. Your father said no middle ground. Is that I mean, there is no middle ground on any of these issues, on interrogations, on Guantanamo Bay. There's just no middle ground at all to be found?
The way to understand that is when you're fighting terror, when you're keeping the country safe, your objective is to keep the country safe. Your objective can't be, let's try to find middle ground, you know, on a political spectrum. You can't look at this as a political issue, and you can't look at it as a test about, well, some decisions make conservatives angry and some decisions make liberals angry. You've got to ignore that, because at the end of the day, saying you made a decision because it was a compromise between liberals and conservatives is not the same as saying you made the best decision to keep this nation safe, regardless of what the political polls say or regardless of what your political opponents say. That's a fundamental difference in approach to this issue.
Now, want to go to, obviously, the New York Times reported today about the fact that, what is it, about 1 in 7 of those that have been released from Guantanamo Bay have returned to the war,
right.
Have returned to fighting America in this war. Where is, not to point fingers, but where is the fault line here? Was it a mistake to ever release them in the first place during the last administration?
Yeah.
Or so what's the answer here?
Well, I think you heard some of that in my dad's speech. You know, during the last administration, we believed, frankly, that we had gone through a very clear vetting process, that the terrorists that we were dealing with at that time were a much larger group at Guantanamo. But even among those who were deemed to be not the most hardened cases, 14% of them returned to the battlefield. And what that ought to be is a very strong cautionary note for the current administration, because the people that were viewed to be sort of the less dangerous of those detainees have already been released. So as they're talking about releasing further detainees, I think they've got to anticipate a much higher recidivism rate given the nature of the people who are still left in Guantanamo.
So, I mean, what was done wrong? What procedures were incorrect in the last administration on this that should have been different? And then in hindsight, you know, your father would say, you know what, this is what we would have done. Wouldn't have released them, treated them all as prisoners of war? I
think you've probably got to look at each individual case. I think that, you know, some of them, I suspect we believed that once they had been through a rehabilitation program, for example, that program, you know, would have been more effective in some cases. It clearly wasn't. But I think what it shows you is why it's so important that we have Guantanamo, and why decisions about what to do with Guantanamo shouldn't be made based on sort of what they're saying about us in European capitals, but they ought to be made based on why you've got to have a facility to hold people who are enemy combatants of this country and who, if released, will return to the battlefield. And it shows why President Obama has gotten himself into such a difficult situation by saying he absolutely will have the facility closed by next January.
Well, obviously, the Vice President thought it's a mistake to close Guantanamo. The President believes it is a symbol. I mean, that shouldn't have entered into the calculus at all, the fact that it had turned into a symbol, even though I do believe the President seemed to make the case, hey, we're going to have Guantanamo North or Guantanamo East or Guantanamo. There's going to be another Guantanamo-like facility because he said there are a group of folks we can't release.
Right. Yeah.
It seemed like that. Go ahead.
At the end, sorry, Chuck. At the end of the day, I think that every president has got to decide how much he's going to listen to protests from Europe and protests from countries outside the United States. And if you look, for example, at what President Reagan did, who's now remembered as the man who ended the Cold War, he was faced with tremendous protests throughout European capitals over issues like deployment of missiles. But at some point, the American president has got to say, look, I know this is going to be unpopular, but it's necessary for America's national security. And I think that there's a real problem if you're listening too much to sort of the opinion pieces and, editorial columns written, in Le Figaro, instead of saying, what do we need to do for American security?
Does the vice president believe, or do you believe, that it was a mistake that this debate didn't happen during the campaign? I mean, it struck me that this was what we saw today would have been, had your father run for president, that we would have had this debate more clearly defined during the campaign. Was this a mistake, do you think, on the Republicans' part?
I think that it serves the American people better to be able to have this kind of debate. So, yes, I'm sorry that we didn't have it during the last campaign. I think it's a critically important debate, and I think that, what you saw today, I suspect that most Americans who watched it felt like they got a much clearer understanding at the end of both speeches about where both men stand on this issue. So I think certainly that kind of substantive engagement helps and is a benefit in every political campaign. I do agree it's too bad we didn't have it last time around.
Liz Cheney, I know you have to run, but thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Chuck.
All righty, we'll see you. Coming up, a very different perspective, we assume. Senior White House advisor David Axelrod. Did his boss answer the critics today?